Welcome everybody. On the wee bit of screen that I can see people from as far east as Nottingham and even further east in Singapore. And I'm guessing there might even be some people west of us. So nice to see everyone. And this morning we're going to be doing the last couple of chapters of the duties of brotherhood. And I did the first presentation. The first presentation was talking about this common enterprise that we have of kind of mutually supporting each other's growth. And this morning's material brings us back on to the nature of mind, the process of growth. So if you notice any similarities between this presentation and the first one that I did, you're correct. There will be, but Al-Ghazali obviously felt the point was worth making a couple of times, so let's find out why. Before we go into the Islamic teachings, a little bit of Buddhism, bit that you might have come across before, and it's this idea that everything's impermanent. Right? And it's one of those ideas. Again, I think a bit like spiritual friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. It's so familiar that you kind of take it as read. Of course, everything's impermanent. But it's one of these things, I think, that the more deeply you inquire into it, the more it discloses. But anyway, just to start off with the very, very sort of basic implication of that, everything's impermanent. Everything arises in dependence on conditions, and that includes friendship. And what we're looking at in the Sigalovada Sutta, what we're looking at in the duties of brotherhood of Islam, is a description of the conditions dependent on which spiritual friendship can arise. What Deepak in our study group sort of made a nice distinction between necessary causes and sufficient causes. So what we're describing in a way are necessary causes, and it's not guaranteed that spiritual friendship will arise in dependence on that. Conditionality is kind of too complex for any outcome to be guaranteed, but you're looking at conditions that pretty much make far more likely, far more possible the emergence of friendship, and a qualitative element to that friendship, the emergence of spiritual friendship. And this chapter goes, again, a little more deeply into the conditions, but let's just have a look at how we got there. So we've been through this process. We started off talking about material aid and rendering assistance. So it's almost like the first condition is just this interest in responsiveness to the needs of our friend. And to the extent that we do that, we're starting to set up the conditions that make relationship possible. So that there's a sort of shift in our attention to what our friend needs on a material level, and then on sort of deeper, more subtle levels. Then there's this, the text goes on to holding one's tongue and speaking out, and saying particularly we're holding our tongue on the habit of criticism, and particularly we're speaking out in two ways, I think. We're speaking out in ways that make our affection for the friend explicit and clear. That Bhante says somewhere in the text that most people can go through, that they have no idea that we might have a slight affection for them. That we can go through our lives really not ever hearing or knowing that people like us, and we kind of don't assume that they do. So Al-Ghazali is suggesting this radical shift in our relationship, and this radical condition for creating spiritual friendship, that if we like somebody, we might say so. Right. So the third and fourth chapters are holding one's tongue and speaking out. And then we went into the chapter on prayer, and in a sense, looking at our deeper mental attention, the quality of our attention, the quality of our response to our friends, and that exploration of metta bhavana. So in all of those, the concern for the friends' well-being, the quality of our communication, the quality of the mental states that we bring to the relationship, all of those are starting to set up the conditions that make friendship possible and that make spiritual friendship possible. It's not random. Things arise in dependence on conditions if we want to set up the conditions that create an effective spiritual relationship. And in the Sigalovada Sutta, Bhante points out, or not even points out, he discovers in the doing of it the relationship between what the Buddha recommends to Sigala and this later teaching of the Samgrahavastus, which are the bodhisattvas' means of gathering, the means of creating community. And it strikes me that you've got pretty much the same in the duties of brotherhood. The main psychological descriptions of the main categories that Al-Ghazali's talking about just seem to me so close to the Sigalovada Sutta categories, so close to the Sangharavastus. And you're looking at articulations of friendship that happened thousands of years apart and thousands of miles apart. And if you've got two texts making basically the same points, you might suspect there's something to it. There's something that's addressing a kind of human need that's independent of geography, independent of time. And just to sort of spell out the connections, this the first of the Sangharavastus is dana, generosity, and mapping that onto the duties of brotherhood, you've got the material assistance and rendering aid. So you've got a pretty close connection. Came across a nice little poem this morning from Naomi Shihab Nye, who says, the Arabs used to say, when a stranger appears at your door, feed him for 3 days before asking who he is, where he's from, or where he's headed. That way, he'll have strength enough to answer, or you'll be such good friends that they don't care. So that cultural attitude of generosity gets that kind of emphasis. The second of the duties, the rendering assistance, maybe you can map onto Artacharya and the Sangharavastus. Artacharya is just devotion to the good of others. So it's that sort of deeper, subtler attention to the needs of others, attention to the needs of our friend. You get in the Sangharavastus the emphasis on affectionate speech, which again obviously maps on to speaking out, holding one's tongue. And then in the Sigalovada Sutta, the Samanartha, which gets translated sometimes as exemplification. In one of the translations of the Sigalovada Sutta, it just means, it gets translated as sincerity. And in that sense, I think sincerity or exemplification just means that we start to act in line with our values. We sort of, our actions start to express what actually we more deeply care about. So again, the exemplification, sincerity in the Sangharavastus bring us on to the chapter today in the duties of brotherhood, of loyalty and sincerity. So today we're going to do loyalty and sincerity, which is chapter 7, and chapter 8, which is informality. Not an awful lot to say about that, but there's something. So the chapter 7 starts off loyalty and sincerity by saying the meaning of loyalty is steadfastness and love, maintaining it to the death with your brother, and after his death with his children and his fellows. And then there's a second part to the verse which sort of shifts it a gear. Certainly in the seminar, it shifts it a gear. So the verse goes on, for love is for the sake of the other life. If it's severed before death, the work is in vain and the effort is wasted. So loyalty and steadfastness, and then this idea that love is for the sake of the other life. So I want to kind of deal with each of these separately as the seminar does. So the starting point, there's a very simple point to be made in this thing about the meaning of loyalty is steadfastness and love. And that's just an intention, a commitment to keeping the relationship going and doing what we need to keep the relationship going. I've sat in a number of formal Kalyana Mitra relationships, got quite a spread of experience on the retreat here, and some people will have been through Kalyana Mitra ceremonies. Some people will be maybe not so familiar with them. But the Kalyana Mitra ceremony is basically a kind of commitment to friendship. And there's always a little kind of exhortation and talk. If you're officiating at the ceremony, part of your responsibilities as the person officiating is that you give a little bit of an exhortation, a little bit of a talk. But there's only one point that gets emphasised, and I think this comes from how Bhante, how Sangharakshita used to do the ceremonies. And that is that you point out to the people making that relationship, entering into a Kalyana Mitra relationship, is that the one responsibility they've got is to stay in connection. So that in a way, it's as simple as that. You're just committing to staying in connection, and not just formal connection, but with a bit of curiosity in it. What makes it possible to create a deeper quality of connection with each other? So in a sense, that's the kind of first basic point arising out of this, that if spiritual friendship is important to us, if we take it seriously what the Buddha's saying, that spiritual friendship's the whole of the spiritual life, we're registering its importance and we're making the choice that we need to make to keep that connection alive and growing. So that's the first, in a way, the sort of obvious point. I want to come back to the second part of it, this idea that love is for the sake of the other life. I think I had a go at that in the previous talk, and I think there was more than one person left kind of puzzled about what I was trying to say. So I'm going to build up my courage for this one and come back to it after the low-hanging fruit and the easy points. So there's another couple of points that are made in this chapter that again are kind of straightforward, I think. That there's a point that Al-Ghazali makes, that if one acquires importance, sees one's authority expand and one's dignity increase, under these new conditions, if you lord it over your friend, you are unworthy. And again, I think in a way that's making a simple point, that often I think our relationships grow kind of accidentally out of circumstance. And it means if our circumstances change, maybe we move house, or maybe our job changes, or even in this one, our sort of status changes, our social status changes, the conditions that gave rise to the friendship have changed. So the friendship changes. It's been a kind of an accident of circumstance. And what's being said here, I think, is that, again, you're sort of shifting to a deeper level, where the intention to sustain the relationship is independent of the particular circumstances that we're in. And there's a clarity that because that's a central value, in a way that the other circumstances arrange themselves around the importance of the relationship. I was trying to think does this happen much in the spiritual community? And I was sort of embarrassed to find, yep, it does, and I do it. And I was thinking, I don't think this happens. And then I remembered a friend of mine being appointed to a position of high responsibility and how outraged I was and how competitive I felt. So it turns out it does happen in the spiritual community, at least in my particular corner of it. So it may or may not apply to you. But just this idea that sometimes our relationships are quite a network of values and quite a network of connections. Some of them are to do with, well, whatever sort of particular needs that we have. And what we're doing here, I think, is just recognising again the value of friendship in itself and allowing that to stay a committed quality of relationship. Another point that I think is a practical point that Al-Ghazali makes, and he says, brotherhood is a subtle essence. If you do not guard it, it's exposed to misfortunes. And then he goes on, so guard it by self-control. And then again, one of these little bits of judo, he says, even to the point of apologising to one who has wronged you, so that you do not overrate your own virtues and your brother's failings. So I think it's just interesting to think, so what's that getting at? What's that talking to in our own behaviour? And again, I hope this isn't too autobiographical, right? And I'm not embarrassing myself in front of an audience, but sometimes when things go wrong in my connection with other people, my first assumption is that it's their fault. I think there are probably some people whose first assumption is that it's your own fault, but that is definitely not my habit. My habit is, you made me do it, right? And the problem is yours. Somebody was pointing out to me the other day my habit of explaining to them why a difficulty is their responsibility, and they were suggesting that I might want to take a little bit more responsibility for what happens. But I think when there's friction, whatever we do, whether we put the blame out there or whether we put the blame in here, there's a tendency to polarise. There's a tendency for the relationship to break, or for that flow of energy to break. And I think what's being said here is that whenever there's friction, the quality of the mental state is our responsibility. If we break the connection, we have a responsibility for that. And this instruction to apologise, even if we feel we've been wronged, is us taking responsibility for the quality of our mental state. That the event isn't under our control. Our response is. We can start to, in a way, what practice is more and more is taking responsibility for how we respond to the situations that we're in. And we're moving towards a situation, and again, this is a practice, but you're just noticing whenever we move back to the habits of clinging or the habits of aversion, and whenever that happens, we're stepping back into setting up the momentum towards openness and connection. So that's always the direction that we're trying to go in practice, and a break in that is always our responsibility. But we never have to respond with aversion. I'll try and remember this once the retreat has finished. Again, you can find easy parallels with Buddhist teaching, Buddhist practice. We've had references to the 8-point mind training quite often in this retreat already. In verse 5 in the 8-point mind training says, when someone out of envy does me wrong, by insulting me and the like, may I accept defeat and offer victory to them. And again, it's not a self-abasing thing, it's just noticing our own habit of self-assertion and connecting back to the deep value of wanting to make connection. And what is it that serves that connection? So that's the kind of project that we're committing to. Okay, that's some of the kind of obvious points. They're obvious, but they're not easy. the famous story, so simple a child of 7 can understand it. And the famous response, so hard to put into practice that an old man of 70 can't do it. Right? So even though the points are not hard to understand, that shift in momentum in our practice, it's possible actually, but it's possible because we're clear about what we're trying to do. And whenever we move back to habit, we're putting energy behind doing it. So you create a momentum. So then the text goes on, love is for the sake of the other life. And I'm almost tempted to skip this because my mind goes to some quite abstract places with this, but I feel if I'm going to do the text justice that we need to kind of try and see what's this getting at. And it might be the smartest thing to do would be just to recommend to the study groups, you might want to think about this. What does it mean that love is for the sake of the other life? And even Bante's unpacking of it, what does it mean? So Bante goes on to say, this seems to be the crucial sentence. It suggests that love or brotherhood has its ultimate significance on the non-physical plane. And I don't know if your study groups have already gone there, or if this is an area that you could still explore, but I think it's interesting just to think, what does that mean? What's that getting at? And I think it's one of these things where, look, I'm really noticing my own slightly abstract turn of mind on this. The way I would unpack this might not be the way that it would make emotional sense to you. So I think just to try and go into it a little bit and think, what's this getting at? That love or brotherhood has its ultimate significance on the non-physical plane. So Bante unpacks it further. So let's just try and follow his argument a little bit more. So he says, is there anything in Buddhism that doesn't pass on and which can be permanently an object of your affection? And then he goes on to say, one could say that the evolutionary process itself is that thing. When your metta is directed towards someone, you envisage their spiritual progress continuing, so to speak, indefinitely. Therefore, your good wishes continue indefinitely. So one might say that you don't love someone for the sake just of what they are now, but also for the sake of what they can become. And that development can continue, so to speak, infinitely. So your love, therefore, has an infinite object. So this is getting to something quite significant, I think. It would be good if the study groups can grapple with it a little bit. What's this getting at? So this idea that your metta is directed to this sense of somebody else's spiritual progress continuing indefinitely. So again, I'm sort of curious, what's that getting at? What's that trying to say? And I'm interested if people can find echoes of that in their own friendships, their own relationship. So if you don't mind, I do want to try and unpack it a little bit further. And I think in a lot of Buddhism, like you start Buddhist practice, you're looking at mindfulness, you're looking at metta. You're looking at a practice that supports a deepening awareness, and you're looking at a practice that supports a deepening connection. If you look at the high end of Buddhism, if you look at the goal, as it were, it's described in terms of wisdom and compassion. You're looking at a deeper, clear seeing of the nature of things, and you're looking at this open-hearted response to the life around us. And that pattern, it seems to me, runs right through Buddhist practice. You've got a deepening quality of awareness, and you've got a deepening quality of kindness and love. And you get these little paradoxes. I hope I can remember this, but in the Diamond Sutra, for example, you vow to save all beings while realizing there are no beings to save. And it sounds like a paradox, That actually, I think the Diamond Sutra is trying to say one is the condition for the other. It's not a contradiction. They're fundamentally two ways of trying to say the same thing. On the one hand, you've got this letting go of self-clinging, this letting go of self-identification. That's the wisdom aspect. And on the other hand, you've got the compassion aspect, the reflex of letting go of self-clinging is not a depersonalization. The reflex of letting go of self-clinging is love. So that link of wisdom and compassion, that link of metta and mindfulness is a relationship that runs right through Buddhist practice. And I think what you're getting at, or to me what this text is getting at, is this shift away from the accidents of circumstance, the kind of accidents of our own response, to a deepening quality of awareness and an opening up that informs our response to the world around us. I hope you've got the patience for this. When I was writing this, I was thinking I wouldn't mind almost just coming at this a bit meditatively. I think, again, it's not a hard idea to get, or sometimes it is a hard idea to get. And what I think is trying to evoke, it's easier to get an experiential feel of sometimes than it is to get a conceptual handle on what it is that it's meaning. So I wanted to ask, could we spend just 5 minutes stopping for a minute and just looking at our own experience? So again, it's easier for me to see people in the room. People up for that? 5 minutes? Right, so those of you on screen, I'm afraid the group in the room have just voted in favour of spending 5 minutes. So if you don't mind going along with that, let's give it a go. And I just want to look a little bit at the quality of awareness.
Rashi, I don't have complete clarity on what I'm being asked to do. The letter speaker.
Oh.
I don't have complete clarity about what I'm being asked to do.
Don't worry, I'm going to ask you to begin with to pay attention to your breath, and then I'll suggest a couple of places to take our attention as we do it. So thank you for asking for clarity, and I will try and explain what we're going to do. And nothing fancy, just really basic stuff. So just take our awareness to the breath and awareness to the body. And just allowing ourselves to connect with the experience itself. What is the breath? What does it feel like for this next breath to come into the body? What is it that tells us what that breath is like? Just noticing that the mind can take a bit of coaxing sometimes to connect to experience. Just starting to become interested and curious about the sensations of the breath. And just using that traditional formula of body, feelings, mind. Just having a sense of our hearts, sense of how we feel right now, a sense of how we're responding to how we feel. Sense of the heart gradually softening and opening. Just interested in whatever arises, responding to it with awareness and kindness. And one of the traditional images for the mind is sitting with the mind like a blue sky. So this sense of clarity, this sense of openness and spaciousness. And just noticing whatever arises in that space. If it's a breath, just aware of the breath rising and falling. That spaciousness stays consistent. You don't need to get caught in the breath. If a feeling arises, you can be completely present to it, responding to it with interest, with kindness. Again, just aware of it rising, coming into being and passing, aware of it changing moment by moment. And to the extent that we can, just staying connected to our body, that sense of groundedness, that open-heartedness, that spaciousness. And just see if you can get a sense of what mindfulness feels like. What does it feel like to be a bit more connected to ourselves? A bit more alive to our experience? A bit less caught up in the specifics? Now just bringing our awareness back into the room. So I wanted to come back, if I may, to this idea of impermanence. I'm trying to find the verse. Back to Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali says, "Lasting affection is that which is for the sake of God. That which has some other object passes away with the passing of the object." And I think that's kind of Buddhist. I think what Buddhist teaching's trying to get at, it's trying to get to a million things, but one of the central things it's trying to get at is that we get lost in external experience. We're looking for stability in things that are fundamentally impermanent. And that actually the teaching is to bring attention back from what's going on out there to the quality of our response to what's going on out there. And you get this paradox that what we think of as substantial, the world around us, when you start to look at it, it's evanescent. The beautiful little Tsongkhapa verse where he says, if I can find it, "All worldly things are brief, like lightning in the sky. This life you must know as this tiny splash of a raindrop, a thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being." So again, this is familiar ground, but there's a couple of aspects of that. One is the transience of it, and the other one is the beauty of it. There's nothing sort of despondent about this. It's waking up to the evanescent, beautiful life and experience. But you get this paradox, and I suppose what I was trying to get at a bit in the meditation is that the mind's capacity to be stable and attentive and kind in relationship to transient experience is where the stability comes from. And then a bit paradoxically, the quality of the mind is more real than the evanescent, transient quality of anything arising independent on conditions. And what Buddhist practice is trying to do, this whole thing about sort of moving to the mind, is starting to move from what's incidental, accidental, conditioned, into something that's more profoundly part of the nature of things. And we might not quite exhaust it, we might not quite understand it, but you're starting to touch into, plug into something that's more deeply real in us. But it's not something static. What we're becoming alive to, how is it Bhante puts it, when you envisage our spiritual progress continuing, you envisage it, so to speak, indefinitely, infinitely. And it's not that that's some abstract idea. It's like when you become alive to your own unfolding experience, every moment is a new disclosure, a new unfolding into awareness. So it's infinite in the sense of it's never exhausted. And the mind's capacity to be available to that unfolding process of becoming is never exhausted. And when you start to get a bit of a flavour of that, our relationship to the whole world changes. Like Bhante says somewhere that the ego's not a thing, the ego's a way of functioning. It's the mind trying to grasp and trying to fix experience. And once we stop trying to grasp and trying to fix, there's an opening up to the whole field of our experience, and the boundary between self and other starts to become much less clearly drawn, as it were. Bhante uses, in the seminar text, he uses the image from the Gandhavyuha Sutta, a sutra of beams of light interpenetrating each other. And I think when that tight self-reference starts to soften a little bit, what becomes clearer, I remember Saramati one time talking about the Mahayana as relational Buddhism. And it's almost like this is kind of provisional, but metaphorically, the nature of reality is relational, it's self and other. So Martin Buber says, I have no teaching, I carry on a conversation. So that the nature of reality is conversational. It's our experience and relationship with the whole field of experience, inverted commas, of other. Anyway, to try and keep it a little simpler, what's being said is that you're shifting from the accidents of experience onto a deeper quality of attention to the quality of our own responses, but even the quality, the nature of our own minds. And we start to more alive to that, we become more alive to it in others. You start to wake up to that current in ourselves and in others. And our relationship is what's deepest in us coming into relationship with what's deepest in our friend. And I wanted to say one more thing. This came up in our study group yesterday, that Buddhist philosophy is trying to describe what reality is like. Spiritual friendship is us realizing what reality feels like. Right? That sense of openness, responsiveness, connection, love, gratitude, care for the well-being of another is the natural relationship to the world when we let go of self-clinging. And if Banty's saying before, if you worry about what it means, the sort of going beyond self-clinging, you're getting a clue, I think, in friendship of what that feels like. Sort of like friendship's almost like where we've got emotional access to the kind of felt sense of what otherwise can be a bit conceptual. So again, you've got this introspective examination of the nature of our own experience. And then we come into relationship on the basis of that. The relationship supports the awareness supports the relationship. And we end up with a conversational nature of reality. So you may well have a more articulate and simpler reading of what this is getting at. But I would like us to take seriously in the study this idea that love or brotherhood has its ultimate significance on the non-physical plane. You might not have quite agreed with my exposition of it, but in that case, what do you think this is getting at? So, question for the groups. 2 last points to make. Excuse me for talking for so long. But the text goes on to the 8th chapter. I'm going to deal with this much more briefly. But the 8th chapter is relief from discomfort and inconvenience. And Al-Ghazali says, don't make your friendship a source of annoyance or trouble or difficulty for the friend. So that's the last instruction. And what's being said is that we're setting up a quality of connection that's generous enough and affectionate enough and kind enough and forgiving enough and so committed that our friend can trust it, that in those conditions, the friend can relax. Right? That you've got this sense of being able to, in an unconstrained way, each of you comes into relationship with the other. And the earlier chapters describe the conditions that make that at least more likely, at least more of a possible outcome. Last bit of the text, a quote, another story. A man said to Al-Junaid, brothers are scarce in these times. Where am I to find a brother in God? And I think quite often we feel we don't have the depth of connection that we want. We don't have the depth of relationship that we want. And Al-Junaid made him repeat this 3 times before replying. If you want a brother to provide for you and to bear your burden, such, by my life, are few and far between. But if you want a brother in God, whose burden you will carry and whose pain you will bear, then I have a troop I can introduce you to. So what you've got in the text is just this lovely description of a quality of attention and responsiveness to other people that make possible this flowering of spiritual friendship. And with that relationship, with that intention to come into relationship on that basis, Al-Ghazali has a troop that he can introduce you to. Okay, so let's finish and go to our groups and see if we can plumb. Just before we go to the groups, this afternoon we're going to have a last checkout, and in the checkout we're just going to explore a little bit implications of the seminar, but Sadaloka is going to tell us a little bit more detail of what's happening this afternoon.
Okay, well, not much more to say than Dharmarati just said, but this afternoon we're going to just go to our groups, and we'll be in the groups for about 40 minutes and really just reviewing the retreat, what has stood out for you in the retreat, and seeing if you can draw up precepts for yourself. The retreat ends, we've talked a lot about friendship, now we go out and do it. And how are we going to take our practice of friendship deeper? What's the next step or next steps for each of us? So it'd be very good if we could draw up precepts for ourselves in the group and have some really concrete ideas about what we're going to do to start to live our friendships more fully. So we'll have that time in the groups just to round up, check out, and find some precepts. Then we'll come back together at 4:15 UK time. So that's about 40 minutes together, 5 minutes just to reassemble. Those of us at Istana will come to the shrine room. And then we'll just hear a few words from everyone, just complete the retreat and finish with a transference of merits, a brief ceremony to end our time together. So
let's have a 15-minute break now. 15-minute break now in the groups.
No.
Break now.
Okay, so Dharmarati suggests we have a break now before we start the groups, as we've gone on a little bit longer this morning. So we'll have a break now for 15 minutes and we'll start the groups in 15 minutes from now, discussing what the 7th and 8th duties that Dharmarati has outlined for us this morning. Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.